One of the best mods you can do to any car is the suspension. Whether you're installing coilovers or just replacing maintenance items, you want to make sure you're doing it right. Because if you don't do it right, you might cause premature wear to those brand new components or even other components, and you might also compromise the handling. So today we're going to talk about preloading your suspension. Preloading is necessary for many rubber bushings, since rubber bushings are only meant to twist a certain amount. But when you are changing your suspension, especially even when you're changing the ride height of your suspension, you want to make sure you torque down those bushings at the optimal state. And that's usually ride height. And the reason you do that is so that way when the car is sitting on the ground on its own weight on the wheels, the suspension is at ride height, and you want to make sure all the bushings are at that state, and that's where they're starting. Because if they're already twisted before you set it down, before they're on their own load, then what's going to happen is it's going to overextend. And you definitely don't want that, because whenever you overextend rubber, it's pretty obvious what happens. It'll tear and it'll fail. Now, let me give you an example. When we have a car jacked up, whether it's on a two-post lift or if you have it on jack stands, the suspension is going to droop all the way down as far as it can go because there's no weight on it. And if you were to loosen some of those bolts that hold those rubber bushings in place, you're going to see that rubber bushing twist. Whether it's the whole control arm or just the bushing, it's going to twist to that droop state. Now when you bring the car back down on its own weight, that suspension is going to also go up and it's going to twist that bushing. So as you see, if you had tightened it down when it was on droop, when the car sits, it's going to be right here. It's already going to be twisted. Now let's say you're driving on the street and you're going through dips and bumps and stuff, it's going to have to twist even more. And all that twisting is already going to get overextended, and that's going to cause that bushing to prematurely fail. And it might also cause issues with handling in general because, that's not the optimal state where the bushing wants to be. If it's already twisted at ride height, it's already loaded a little bit. And that's just going to cause more issues with handling. It might be a little bit unpredictable. It might even cause your ride height to be a little bit different than what it should be. Now, a lot of people have coilovers, and whenever you install coilovers, you're going to make minor adjustments here and there. But those minor adjustments are going to be a couple millimeters at that, so that's not necessarily, a criteria of readjusting the preload on the suspension, but it is still good measure. So, how are you supposed to preload bushings, and which bushings need to be preloaded? Let me show you guys. So this right here is a control arm. Some people also refer to it as a thrust arm. Now you can see right here, this is a rubber bushing. It's pretty solid. This one's completely worn out, but you can see how there's a spot right here where the metal is. This is where the bolt goes through, and all this rubber around it is attached directly to this metal sleeve. When this is installed, once you tighten down across this metal section, now this metal section is secure. So all the flex is going to happen in the rubber on the outside. So if you have this set, you tighten it down when the suspension is drooping. Once you start loading the car back down, bring it all the weight on it, it's going to start twisting, not where it's supposed to be. So you want to make sure this is tightened down at ride height. So the way you would do that is you would bring the car down, make sure it's on its own wheels, have the bushing and everything, all the bolts and all that stuff through it, just not tightened down. Now once the car is sitting, whether you put it on ramps or if the ramps are not high enough, you can make your own ramps out of 2x4s. Once you have it set down, then you tighten the bolt and the nut that's going to be holding this in place. And that way it's going to be at ride height, completely torqued down. Now when you lift the car back up, when the suspension droops, it's going to twist the other way, which is fine, because once you bring the car back down on its own weight, it's going to go back to the state where it needs to be. And this is the same for whenever you're driving, going through bumps and dips. It's going to always be twisting back and forth, but it's always going to come back to ride height, which is where you have it torqued down. Now, you may ask which bushings. So like I showed, this rubber bushing has that the metal sleeve in the middle, but the rubber is attached directly to this metal sleeve. Now some bushings that don't do this are polyurethane bushings. So usually polyurethane bushings are either 2 or 3 piece. They have a metal sleeve that goes through them. And that metal sleeve is allowed to freely twist and turn. And in that case, you don't have to worry about preloading it, because once you bring the car down, or whether it's going up and down, that metal sleeve is twisting independently from that polyurethane as opposed to this rubber. Now another suspension component that usually don't have to preload are ball joints, because they're also free to twist and turn. But there are some ball joint applications such as sway bar links that are supposed to be preloaded or just set at ride height. And in that case, you just want to follow the manufacturer's directions and do so accordingly. Most of these rubber bushings that require the preload are going to be control arms, thrust arms, lateral arms, stuff like that. Most of these newer cars, whatever kind of car you have, they all have them. Even trucks have them. So you want to make sure you're, torquing them down and setting that preload at ride height. Some bushings go even as far as having these serrated edges. When it's serrated, those serrations dig into that section of wherever this bolts into, and that's what keeps it locked in place. Now, in that case, you want to make sure that when you're setting the car down and getting it on its own weight, you want to make sure this whole thing is twisting and not just the bushings. Because sometimes those serrations can get dug in, usually onto the subframe, and it won't allow it to twist. So you might have to loosen the bolt a little bit more. Now here's an example of a sway bar link which also has these ball joints. And these are supposed to be set and tightened down when you are at ride height because the hole that these usually go into have a little bit of play. And you want to make sure that this is sitting inside of there at a neutral position. That way it still has room to move around. And that's why you want to torque those down when you are at ride height. Now another thing you want to do whenever you're doing any kind of suspension work, you want to always make sure you get in alignment right after. Because whenever you're tweaking one thing, chances are it's also tweaking another thing in terms of alignment settings. And that's also a good plus if you're not too comfortable with preloading or if you don't have the proper space and stuff like that. You want to try to get it as close to ride height as you can and preload it accordingly as much as your space allows. And once you're done with that, just go directly to the alignment shop. Let them know that you did all the suspension work and you need to have them reset those preload settings. Because what they can do is they're just going to drive it onto the alignment rack, which will have all four wheels on the actual rack itself. All the weight of the car will also be on it. So they can loosen all those control arm rubber bushing sections and then retighten them down once the bushing settles back to the ride height. I hope you found this information useful because this is an item that's often overlooked and you don't want to install all those new components just to make them prematurely fail. Make sure you leave a like or a comment down below if you have any questions or if you have any comments. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you guys in our next video.